opportunity.
Sorry, Anna, go ahead. It always does that.
So thank you, Joe, very much for the exciting opportunity to participate in the SEND talks. And thank you to all who are joining us today. So the focus of this presentation is on this set of skills that we call oral language, and which research shows is an essential tool for personal and cognitive development throughout a person's life. I will cover how oral language includes and can be assessed by a variety of component skills and why we focus on discourse level oral language skills. That is, the ability to extract and construct meaning carried across different utterances. The core of this presentation is about the increasing interest in the potential of discourse level skills as a valid and ecological tool to assess the child's oral language knowledge and to track the development of this knowledge over time. I will present some very preliminary data on the macro and micro level features in the oral narratives of young children. Also, I will present, again, very preliminary findings describing the speech pattern of young children while narrating a story. We think that our data, though very preliminary, has potential to contribute to the ongoing debate on how to assess and track oral language skills, and taps into the less explored issue of how the speech pattern of the narrative produced can also inform on the child's cognitive and linguistic skills. These two issues will be the heart of my presentation, which I will approach with an aim to reflecting on how a better understanding of the characteristics of oral narratives analyzed in this analytical way can inform teaching practice and help both to detect children who struggle with particular aspects of oral language and support growth of discourse level oral language skills. Developing good oral language skills since an early age is a matter of importance. Not only language skills are necessary for children to express their own needs and to understand what others say to them, also, poor oral language skills have been linked to long-term weaker achievements in the educational and occupational domains, as well as with higher levels of personal anxiety and poorer family links. Some room for optimism, though, comes from the fact that teaching practice can be a way forward to counterbalance this. Recent studies have shown that learning environments that invite children to participate in more symmetrical interactions and foster active learning, active engagement with learning through verbal discussion are effective, promoting emotional and social gains in children. Oral language skills are key for school achievement too, and it is the particular relation between early oral language skills and later literacy achievement that has captured the focus of many studies. Models of reading and writing include oral language as a key component. The simple model of reading states that besides word recognition, language comprehension is necessary to extract meaning from written texts. After a child identifies the orthographic form of a word, access to a semantic representation is necessary for that word to make sense in the text. Similarly, both the simple and the not so simple view of writing models state that idea and content generation require oral language skills. That is, the child will have to translate his ideas into linguistic form to be able to convey the intended meaning to others. It could be argued that in these models, the oral language construct is a bit underspecified, but then many studies provide good level of details about the specific nature of the relation between the different components of oral language and reading and writing. It is beyond the scope of this presentation to cover this issue exhaustively. It will suffice to briefly remember that studies exploring whether and how phonology, vocabulary, and grammar impact literacy development have established that children identified as having persistent poor oral language over the period between ages 4 to 6 fall further and further behind their peer group in vocabulary growth over time, and are at higher risk for having difficulties with oral narratives and in reading. Because children's difficulties with oral language were present at school entry and persisted throughout childhood, we understand that the oral language weaknesses are not the consequences of literacy impairment, but a source for it. Of interest, though, studies have shown that children identified as struggling with oral language at age 4, who later catch up in their oral language skills, do less poorly compared to typically developing peers than the children whose difficulties persist. So early identification and appropriate intervention are key. The speech and language difficulties are the most common disability of early childhood. A rough estimate says that between 7 and 15% of the total pupils enter school with poor language skills, which are unexplained by other developmental challenges. And this figure is even higher in areas of social disadvantage, and yet oral language difficulties are the least well detected. Despite the fact that the majority of these children will be in mainstream classrooms, reality shows that teachers find assessing oral language difficult. There is a lack of reliable, valid, and easy to administer tools, and there is no gold standard of what differentiates a child with language learning needs from the one who just struggles with it. And of course, the importance of assessing and tracking oral language skills concerns typically developing pupils as well. Even those who enter school with an adequate development of the language score grammar and with adequate vocabulary knowledge are a long way from being able to use the language as a tool for creative thinking and independent learning. There is increasing evidence that supporting the development of oracy skills in the classroom yields cognitive gains such as retention of content and ability to transfer reasoning skills across subjects. There is therefore need for a much more exhaustive and detailed characterization of what aspects of oral language are important at each stage of schooling and how these can be supported by teaching practice and assessed by teachers and clinicians. For this, language assessment needs to go beyond tasks that reduce oral language to the sound word and sentence level, and do not give account of the child's ability to use the language in context and for a communicative purpose. Sorry. And this brings us to the, And this brings us to the discourse level oral language skills. Discourse skills have been conceptualized as higher order skills that require knowledge of vocabulary and grammar, but also cognitive skills, comprehension monitoring, and inference making. For children in the early years of schooling, oral narratives seem to be an adequate window into their discourse level skills. And oral narratives are gaining strength as a potentially powerful tool of oral language assessment. So what is an oral narrative? Well, it has been defined as a monologue describing an experience or events that are chronologically sequenced and causally related. And research seems to point that even if producing a narrative is challenging, or maybe precisely because of what makes it challenging, assessing the narrative skills of children is a highly contextualized task that represents realistic learning demands, provides a more naturalistic and ecologically valid context, and is a potentially less biased language analysis tool relative to standardized language assessments. However, using narratives as an assessment tool requires making a few decisions regarding the testing procedures, and these decisions have created differences in the available research which have implications regarding the way in which the results can be interpreted and compared. I will quickly mention just two of these issues. One is whether receptive, expressive, or both skills must be assessed, as it is sometimes assumed that the two modalities represent two separate constructs, even though this idea has not been confirmed by empirical evidence. A second issue concerns which type of task to use. While receptive discourse skills, let's say the ability to understand an oral text, is tested in quite a consistent way across studies, this is not the case regarding the assessment of expressive discourse skills, where the tasks and prompts used in different studies underlie differences that can be of relevance. With regard to the task, a retelling paradigm where the child listens to a story that he is then requested to recall is been more widely used than the storytelling paradigm, where the child is asked to produce a spontaneous story following a prompt. In fact, prompts also present some variety, and while a number of studies have used pictures books for the child to go through to either retell or tell a story, a few other studies use a single picture prompt, allowing the child much more freedom. The results I present today are part of an ongoing longitudinal study that tracks the oral language trajectories of children that attended reception and year 1 in 9 different schools last year and are currently in year 1 and year 2. The full sample consists of 250 children, but today I present findings for a subsample of 101 children, aged around 4 years and 9 months and 5 years and 9 months at the time of testing. With these children, we use the BPBS and the KELF to assess the receptive vocabulary and core language skills of the children, and the TNL to assess their narrative skills. The TNL assesses both the receptive and expressive modalities of the language. It is administered in 3 subtasks, each consisting of a listening comprehension task, followed by a task of story production. The results I will now present correspond to the third expressive task of the TNL, a story elicited with this single picture prompt. A very quick into the children's language skills show that both the reception and year 1 groups scored about the mean standard score in the vocabulary, core language, listening comprehension, and of particular interest here, the expressive narrative tasks. Therefore, we can say that these subsamples seem to be able to be representative of children attending any mainstream reception or year 1 classroom in a London school. Let me show you how the expressive score was obtained. The Pnl Scoring Scheme consists of 2 different blocks, a story content and a story complexity block. In the story content that we are seeing, children can get up to 18 points if their stories mention a series of predefined characters and actions. These predefined characters and actions reflect the pattern of the story the children were read to just before the expressive task. For example, the children get a point if their stories mention that the children in the story, the children's parents came back to the park, which is what happened in the comprehension passage. However, this can be seen as problematic because the task instructions do not require the child to make a story that resembles the listening comprehension passage. The child is only requested to tell a story that is even better than the story he just heard. So if a child produces a story that agrees well with the prompt, but departs markedly from the model story, he might be underscored compared to another child whose story is comparably good, but better adjusted to the previous story. In the story complexity block, children can get up to 12 points for explicitly including temporal and/or causal relations between the events in the story, making no grammatical mistakes, including dialogue, and making a coherent story that includes the basic units of story grammar. Though the complexity blocks relies less tightly to the listening comprehension passage, there are still aspects for which the child gets no credit. For instance, the use of relative clauses that children of this age are starting to use as a means to provide detail about characters and objects. And also some criteria is vague and open to variation between raters. For instance, the one we see, agreement on whether a story is complete or elaborated beyond what is pictured is not always straightforward in a task elicited with a single picture prompt. So in all, though the TNL may be a reliable tool to assess whether children are performing below, above, or at the standard level compared to other children of the same age, it may lack sufficient analytical detail to provide teachers and clinicians with a specific guidance regarding where the child struggles with aspects of narrative discourse skills and how such weaknesses can be supported. In this context, we decided to use SALT to transcribe and code our sample of oral narratives using a coding scheme that characterizes how children use, while narrating, well-established macro and micro level features. The macro level of a story refers to the general organization of the story, as well as to the linguistic means deployed to maintain coherence and cohesion throughout the oral text. It is considered to reflect the child's mental model of the story and his ability to keep this model active while narrating. The micro-level features capture the lexical and syntactic choices made to convey the meaning through oral clauses and utterances. It reflects at least the vocabulary and grammar skills of the child. Although research agrees that both levels yield relevant information when profiling a child's oral narrative skills, today there is no gold standard guideline to identify which outcome variables should be tracked during narrative assessment. To capture performance at the macro level, we examine three features. The first is a structure, which refers to the presence in a narrative of the units of a story grammar. The literature establishes that a complete narrative includes 7 different units, and we gave each narrative 1 point for each unit the child had included in the story. In this example, we see how a child in year 1 included an element of opening defined as a start to the narrative, a character. At least one character is needed for a narrative to work as such. One element of setting, that is some information regarding the time and location of the narrative. A problem, an event, usually unexpected, that triggers the unfolding story. An attempt, defined as an action performed by characters in response to the problem. And a state of mind, that is a feeling or emotion triggered in the character by the problem. A solution, defined as an event that brings the problem to its end. And a conclusion, which is a remark explicitly signaling the end of the story. This child got the maximum possible score, which was a 7. The second macro level feature was density of information, defined as the total number of elements of each story grammar unit the child includes in the narrative. So density of information differs from structure in that it captures the real amount of relevant information in the narrative. That is, density of information taps onto the child's ability to elaborate or expand on one or more of the story grammar units. Children often include information that is irrelevant to the story. While in the example I have used so far, see the left side of your screen now, very little was left after scores for structure highlighted in red and density of information highlighted in green. In the right-hand side example, we see a story where about half the content is not really relevant to the story. So the third and last feature of the macro level was cohesion. Cohesion refers to the speaker's ability to introduce characters and events in the narrative and to keep referring to them as the narrative goes. This is a challenging skill as it requires thinking about the listener's needs and about the grammatical devices in one's language to address those needs. Also, it's time-consuming to code, and many studies do not examine it. We coded the child's ability to be accurate at cohesion by obtaining the percentage of mistakes the child did referring to a character or being inconsistent in the use of verb tense and number person across the narrative. So in this example, the child was right using indefinite pronouns to first introduce the boy and girl characters in the story, and was right again in resorting to the use of the pronoun they to maintain reference to these characters. If the child had simply repeated, a boy and a girl went to the forest, that would have created confusion in the listener, as happens with the pronouns at the bottom of the page, where the repeated use of the indefinite pronoun for a character that was just mentioned makes the listener think that the first and second pet aliens are not in fact the same one. Let me now explain the three features we coded at the micro level. The first feature is productivity, considered to account for the total amount of linguistic content. We included 4 different variables for productivity: the total number of C units, of clauses, of words, and the total number of different words. Before obtaining productivity scores, all that was clearly superfluous to the intended narratives, basically hesitations, repeated or suspended words, were removed from the story. Then the transcribed narrative was segmented into the total utterances or C units. C units are considered the basic units of analysis in oral speech and consist of any main clause in the oral text plus all its dependent clauses. Next, we computed the number of clauses. A clause is a unit consisting of a subject and its predicate, and a C unit may be formed by one or several clauses. Finally, we computed total number of words in the narrative and the number of different words. The total number of words is probably the most common measure of productivity, and in research on written composition is often taken as a proxy measure of text quality, but it is open to question if this is the case for oral language as well. As for the number of different words, which particularly in short text can be very close to the total number of words, it has been used inconsistently across studies as a measure of productivity or as a measure of lexical or semantic richness. Our second micro-level feature was syntactic complexity, and by such we mean the child's ability to use linguistic devices to combine clauses. We coded the narratives for mean length of utterances, clause density, percentage of complex clauses, and percentage of subordinate and coordinate clauses. Young children typically combine clauses by using coordination. However, with increased exposure to literacy practices at school, they become more aware that temporality and causality are essential features of a narrative. Thus, we wanted to see if children would use subordination more to express the temporal and causal links between the characters and events, as well as complement, such as non-finite or relative clauses, to give details about them. Our third and last micro-level feature is accuracy, defined by presence of grammatical errors. Errors such as lack of tense, person and number agreement and such were counted as grammatical errors. So let's see what our preliminary results tell us about change with school year in the use in the oral texts about, of the micro and macro level features. Our findings show a pattern of growth for all 4 productivity variables between reception and year 1, and a similar, maybe slightly lighter pattern for the variables of syntactic complexity, neither of which, however, reached a statistical significance. As expected, children became more accurate with age and made fewer grammatical errors and also fewer cohesion errors. Now, while the decrease in grammar errors was not significant, the decrease in cohesion errors was. And remember that this means that the children made fewer errors using pronouns for referential purposes. Finally, the increase in both the structure score and the density of information score was significant. And children in year 1 included about 1 more unit of story grammar and 4 more elements of content relevant to the story than their peers in reception. So coming back to our question, our data shows that although all the observed features tend to grow when the performance of children in reception and year 1 is compared, the macro level features of their oral narratives seem to capture their progress better than the micro level features. Next, we examine the relationship between the different variables within features. Our data confirms that all variables of productivity were strongly related, including the total number of different words, which might be interpreted as support for considering this variable a productivity variable. The syntactic complexity variables were significantly correlated too. The fact that all variables correlated negatively with the percentage of coordinate clauses may support the view that around age 5, experience with narrative increases due to schooling. And this broadens both the repertoire of the child's conjunctions and the metalinguistic understanding that causal and temporal relations are explicitly stated in good narratives. When children start to subordinate more, they use coordination less as the main way to combine clauses. For accuracy, we found a moderate positive correlation between grammar and cohesion errors for in year 1 only. This correlation might set out the relevant question of whether it is less strong grammatical skills that cause a struggle or delay at the macro level of cohesion, or if it's children who struggle with the overall organization of the story that then make more grammatical errors. Since the macro level features of the structure and density of information were coded with a single variable, we have no more within feature correlations. Next, we examine the relations across features. A bit to our surprise, neither of the 4 variables of productivity correlated with the proportion of complex utterances or of subordinate clauses. So, although adding a dependent clause necessarily brings in additional words, we do not see that those children who produced longer texts necessarily included more dependent clauses in them. Dependent clauses are complementary, not compulsory by nature. I mean, if a child says, the children were scared when the aliens came out, even if the subordinate clause when the aliens came out adds a nice informative note, the main clause, the children were scared, is equally grammatically correct on its own. That means that producing a subordinate or complement clause responds to the communicative goal of explicitly stating the syntactic relation, temporal, causal, etc., between the 2 events. This communicative goal the young child may either generate or not. And it might be that whether or not he generates that depends to some extent, at least, of how challenging he is finding the task at other levels. With this in mind, let's examine how the syntactic complexity variables were related to the accuracy variables. Both complex utterances and subordinated clauses were negatively related to cohesion errors, but neither negatively nor positively correlated with grammar errors. It is to some extent counterintuitive that the child's skill to produce syntactically complex utterances, remember utterances packed with subordination and such, should be counterbalanced by his ability to keep the story well tied at the referential level, but not by his grammar accuracy at the utterance or clause level. One could argue that at ages 5 and 6, the core grammatical skills are fully consolidated, so those grammar skills no longer correlate with producing complex syntax. However, it seems hard to assume that this holds generally at around age 5. A different explanation could be that if in the context of producing a narrative, the presence of dependent clauses respond, as we just said, to that intentional communicative goal of explicitly marking the temporal or causal nature of the relation between the characters and event in one story. And the child who is telling the story is struggling with keeping cohesion, this may drain the available cognitive resources to further generate information about the when and why of the events. And there the subordinate clauses may go, not necessarily because the child has difficulties with grammar at the utterance level, but because in the macro-micro level competition, something that is not even compulsory might get sent out of the picture. Finally, the correlations between the accuracy and productivity variables show that all productivity variables were negatively correlated with accuracy at the cohesion level only. So again, it would look like in the challenge of online text production, it is not children with faltering grammar skills who produce shorter texts, but that the real burden comes from the macro level features. So again, if the child finds keeping adequate referential ties difficult, then his narrative productivity seems to suffer just as complex syntax did. He may feel that he ran out of content sooner, just as maybe he forgot to add those complementary clauses. A final remark on cross-feature correlations. Productivity variables correlated negatively with density of information, but positively with the structure. And this would support what we said when we went over the variables we have chosen, that while some text extension is certainly needed to include all the units that conform the grammar of a story, young children's narratives get a bit out of focus more often than not if the narratives get too long. Finally, we examine the relation between the micro and macro level features and language performance assessed by standardized measures of vocabulary and core language. Neither of the variables of productivity, syntactic complexity, or density of information correlated with the standardized assessments. A structure correlated with vocabulary, but not with core language. And finally, both cohesion and grammar errors correlated negatively with vocabulary and with core language. So, in the context of the results, a standardized task requiring the child to produce isolated words or sentences may not necessarily inform on the child's ability to use language in context at the discourse level. While the negative correlation between both tests and the child's struggle with grammar and cohesion may tell that these relatively easy to spot errors in narratives may be an indicator of low levels of vocabulary and grammar skills. So I'm going to take 10 seconds for 3 summary remarks on the first part of this presentation. Productivity, which can be captured quite indistinctly by any of the 4 variables, does not seem to capture the oral narrative quality, at least not in terms of presence of linguistic indicators of quality. While longer text allowed more room for units of structure, which is good, the longer the text, the lower the rate of referential cohesion, as well as the rate of relevance of the content produced. The use of complex syntax seems to compete with the use of accurate referential ties in the narration, and future steps will be aimed at establishing the directionality of this relation. Finally, reception and year 1 seem to be a moment of change for accurate cohesion. And if errors both at the utterance and text level persist at this point in schooling, this should maybe flag out the need for targeted assessment. Okay, so now we will move on to the second part of my presentation, which deals with some very preliminary thoughts on how oral language dysfluency may help us understand children's struggle with oral narratives. We already know understanding and producing oral language is challenging, and understanding and producing discourse-level oral language is particularly challenging, compared, let's say, to naming objects, producing isolated sentences, or even to participating in a conversation. The high processing demands inherent to the formulation of discourse result in language dysfluencies, that is, presence of pauses or suspension of language articulation. These dysfluencies have been broadly categorized as serving 2 different functions. Basically, one breaks discourse for cognitive planning or to retrieve language. Adult oral language production has been characterized as typically dysfluent, with an average of 6 to 10 dysfluencies every 100 words. And work has been done to use dysfluencies as a window into language comprehension. Dysfluencies have been much less researched in child language, with the notable exception maybe of a work by Sabin with a sample of over 800 individuals aged 6 to 49. Their data indicated a sharp decrease in pause frequency and duration before 2nd grade, in parallel with the general increase in cognitive processing and language abilities that occur during childhood. More recently, one study examined the differences between adult and child dysfluencies and concluded that dysfluency patterns reflect differences in child and adult language, not in the cognitive resources allocated to language production. In most studies dealing with oral narrative production, dysfluencies are simply dismissed, eliminated from the transcription of the final or intended narration. Just as I showed you before when I said we removed superfluous material to obtain productivity counts. But within the dysfluencies may have a story to tell about the process of building a narration. So next I will present some very preliminary findings of the frequency and type of dysfluency in our sample of oral narratives, as well as the relations between these dysfluencies and the oral narrative features and the child's general oral language skills. We coded 6 types of dysfluencies: silent and filled pauses, repetitions, and repair. And as we may be a bit tired by now, let me quickly walk you through this with an example. Silent pauses preceding a clause are considered to have a planning function, but less clear in the literature is the function of pauses between and within phrases. These ones were the ones pointed in Redford's work as distinguishing adult and children's speech, where children would produce within phrase pauses more than adults typically do. Then we have filled pauses, and a filled pause is a suspension of linguistic articulation that the speaker fills with a sound like These are considered the most interactive-like type of pause, meaning that the speaker fills times in with non-linguistic content to make the listener know that he is still holding the speaker's ground. Field pauses have been linked to difficulties with planning for general organization. We also coded for repetitions, which are suspension of speech and then unintended repetition of one or more words. And finally, we coded for repairs, again, suspension of discourse, to then change the last or final few words said in the text. So our first analysis confirmed that dysfluencies are common in oral narratives, with about 70% of the utterances containing at least one type of the dysfluencies here considered. Also, our results support the research in that pausing between clauses is by far the most prevalent type of breaking one's speech. Our results do not show any significant change in the frequency pattern of any type of dysfluency. So it would be interesting if a follow-up study would confirm previous findings of this being a period of sharp decrease. We examined if the different types of dysfluency were related to each other, and basically our data show that while pauses between clauses and phrases, field pauses and repetitions seem to tap onto a common construct, pauses within phrases and repairs might tap onto a different one. This would be at least partially consistent with Redford's remark that pausing at unexpected places in the clause or in the utterances constitutes a different type of dysfluency, not completely unusual in children, but more rarely seen in adult speech. We took a step further to examine how the frequency of each type of dysfluency associates with the micro and macro features of the produced narrative. Productivity did not correlate with dysfluencies, and we found a lonely negative correlation between field pauses and structure, which might be seen as support to previous findings of a possible link between field pauses and difficulties with general organization. Dysfluent utterances correlated with complex utterances and subordinated clauses. However, more frequent pauses between phrases correlated negatively with complex utterances and positively with cohesion errors. So next steps will clarify if pausing between phrases identify those children who struggle with cohesion accuracy at the cost of generating fewer subordinate clauses. Also, in the context of the results that frequent pausing within phrases correlates with making grammatical errors, frequent self-repairs correlate negatively with all measures of complex syntax. And the previous finding that both pausing within the phrase and repairs are associated in our data, maybe next steps will be taken to clarify if a speech pattern characterized by these unexpected pauses and frequent self-repair may identify children who have problems with the structural language and poor language skills at the utterance or clause level. A final look at the correlations between dysfluencies and vocabulary and core language skills assessed with the standardized assessments further supports the idea that while generally dysfluent narratives do not portray a picture of language difficulty, the negative correlation between vocabulary and pauses at unexpected locations and frequent self-repair may be showing a struggle with language. So, to conclude, the bottom line message that I would like to leave for you to take home is that The macro-level features of narrative production look promising in helping to characterize the child's oral language, and that there is no way to assess and track development in these macro-level features unless the discourse-level oral language skills are assessed. There seems to be competition in the production of micro and macro-level features. The literature describes a trade-off between these two levels, where increased attention to one may result in loss of quality in the other. While it seems logical as a next step to first try to empirically confirm if both levels actually form two separate constructs, and if so, we need more research to describe the terms of this trade-off, of this interaction by which the child progressively adjusts the sentence and text level requirements. If we believe, and we do, that oracy skills can be beneficial at many different levels, it follows that fine-grained knowledge of what component skills are key at different stages of schooling and how this can be supported and assessed is necessary. Finally, we believe our data on dysfluencies, though very exploratory and preliminary, supports at least the interest of continuing to explore narrative skills, taking this double stance of including both the text-based variables and these other variables that offer us a unique window into the actual process of coming up with the oral text. Particularly valuable would be a finding confirming that relatively easy to detect speech patterns may be helpful in the process of identifying those children who may be somewhat struggling with oral language. And I thank you all very much for your attention. And if you have questions, I will do my best to try to respond them.
Thank you very much, Anna, for your very interesting talk. There's lots of data there to unpack, so I'll give people a minute to post any questions or pop on the screen if you have any. And whilst everybody else is thinking of some questions, I've got one, which is that storytelling. How much do you think is storytelling the same as oral language, in that there is obviously an overlap, but very often young children at the age of 5 and 6 or 6 and 7, the ones that you were assessing, they often tell personal stories. So it's about what they've experienced, whereas narratives is more of a planning task, and it's got a very much better structure. So I'm kind of twofold. The question is, one is, how much is there an overlap between their daily oral language and this particular task? But also how much some of the findings might be driven by executive functioning, planning, because it is so much more structured what you're looking for.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, the overlap is clear, but I think that narratives form part of the children's universe since a very early age. I mean, this is a type of language, a type of task with which they are quite familiar at this stage of development. I would say that proof of that is that we may have had like other problems, but all children were able to follow us with the instructions to the tasks. This is a standardized assessment. I think that children are very capable of differentiating what telling a personal story is from telling a fictional story, even though I would say that telling a story might account as a narrative depending on the way the child tells it. I mean, if the child is telling you about personal facts, but he's structuring that language in a chronologically and causally related mode, that might well account for a narrative. I mean, he could be narrating about his own life. About the impact of executive function, that's not the focus of our project, but I mean clearly we would find an impact on that. And I think that this is very much related to this tension that we are finding between the macro and micro levels of the narratives. I mean, where there is limited necessity of planning at the sentence level, I'm not saying none, but limited, for a child of this age to be able of keeping track of the events that he just produced, which are on top of that fictional, because this is a fiction task, that creates a much higher additional challenge. So this is why we think that this is the feature where we have been finding more tension. I mean, this is clearly interacting with the abilities that the child may have at the word or sentence level, and maybe appearing as limited or impaired to some extent in this task because of the tension with this other necessity of integrated consecutive utterances into a coherent whole.
Yeah, that's more my thinking indeed, is whether it's an executive function issue. I think it also links to another question from Irini, is about, was socioeconomic status factored in it as well?
We have that information. It's not part of the. I mean, as I said, these results are very exploratory, very preliminary. But we have information on the SES of children. So hopefully, in a while, we will be able to know more about the relationship between the two. We know that, I mean, that plays a big role in, I was saying, I mean, in areas of social deprivation. We know that the oral language difficulties are even higher than in areas less deprived, in areas less deprived. So that's going to be an interesting thing to explore.
I'm first going to take Hiba's question, because it asks about methods, before going to Helen Frankie's question around impact. But there's a question around, did you take into account gender differences as well, or did you look at any of those?
No, not yet. Again, we have that information. As you could see, I mean, the subsample that I was presenting today is very symmetrical in that way. It's basically half and half, but we haven't explored a difference at gender level.
Okay. A question is from, sorry, I need to scroll up now, from Helen, was about what do you think are the implications of this research in terms of teaching and intervention in the early years? I know it's preliminary data, but where do you hope to go with this study?
Well, I think that even though I think that it's like intuitively, we would all agree that, of course, we have to use discourse, oral language at discourse level. You just started your question by saying, what's the relation between oral language and narrative skills? Well, oral language is necessary, I mean, to produce a narrative or to produce any type of text, but that doesn't mean that, I mean, that brings us to the question of how do we account for oral language? I mean, and frequently, often what we see is that even in research, how we measure oral language, sometimes it's reduced to a measure of perceptive vocabulary. And clearly, I mean, that is going to have an impact at accounting for the child's skills at the discourse level skills. So I think that if we would all intuitively agree that a teaching environment that promotes the development of oracy skills is more beneficial than another environment where interactions are much more asymmetrical, and where the child is not given an opportunity to develop his thoughts and understanding through extensive language, that's going to have ultimately an impact not only in the learning achievements of the child, but in his development in oral language.
Is this something you're looking at as well, educational outcomes in this project as a kind of direct link, or not yet?
We want to, so I mean, one of the main aims of the project is to at least establish how oral language impacts the development of literacy in these early stages. So, I mean, that's data that we have not collected yet, but hopefully if we find a way in the next few weeks, we would like these children who are now in year 1 and year 2 to do a spelling task as well as a reading comprehension and a compositional writing task, so that we can see how these discourse level oral language skills impact literacy development this year.
Great. We've got time for one more question, I think. There's an interesting question about language differences. I'm not sure. So the question is, what kind of differences would you expect in different languages in terms of, say, for example, Spanish versus English? I think indeed is a very difficult question as well. There is a bit of clarification regarding.
I mean, that is something. I mean, the cross-linguistic factor in differences in the results in this kind of research, it's very much my interest. But to be honest, my guess is that with this kind of task and at this point of development, I am not sure that the results would be that much impacted by language. I think that what happens here is that if you are comparing like different languages, you will have also different learning systems. And it is possibly like the characteristics of the educational system and the teaching practice in different countries that will have then an impact on the level of development of oral language at this discourse level, maybe more than the typological differences between languages. I think that maybe if we were looking at differences at the utterance or the sentence level, then maybe we might be able to find some differences with languages being more rich at the morphological level, maybe having different outcomes at that level system compared to a language such as English.
Yeah, I think it links back to the question that Irene is asking as a follow-up question, is about, what you think the relation is between socioeconomic status, how much parents talk at home. But as you say that, if you look at language between different languages as well, you'll also have those differences as well, or not?
Yeah, I mean, so let me see if I understood the questions. I mean, so how would SES impact differently in different languages or in different countries?
For Irene, it was the question of whether you think different socioeconomic status, how that would link to different parental input in terms of children being familiar with telling stories and also oral language input.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, the link, I mean, I would be surprised if the link was not clear. I mean, I think that there is plenty of data supporting that one of the main things about SDS regarding language is that children belonging to higher level economical families are much more exposed not only to a higher amount of language, but to a type of language that is of higher quality. So again, I mean, children are given the opportunity to respond producing complete sentences. Interactions are much more frequent throughout the day. They are probably exposed to a wider variety of interlocutors. I think that we have plenty of evidence already that the link between this and the child's ability to produce a narrative is clear.
No, that's okay, because we're running over time, but there's one more interesting question, I think, because obviously, if that's okay, that we move on from the SES question, because obviously the other interesting data you've got is the dysfluency data results, and I'll allow this last question before we all go, and I understand if people have to leave the meeting already, but do you think the pauses at odd times in between are more reflective of lower level word finding problems rather than perhaps these higher level thinking about what to say next and larger goals? So I think the question is more about how, how significant do you think are these pauses at odd times?
Yeah, so I mean, that's what we are trying to confirm. I mean, from these very preliminary findings, it would seem that as the few research that we have available have said before, pausing, let's say at the beginning of the clause, would be like related to planning, is very frequent both in child and adult speech, and would not be having a clear impact on the type of or quality of the language produced, but that this kind of more unexpected pausing within the phrase. So I mean, let's imagine like between the copulary verb and the main verb, or okay, this kind of the preposition and the noun phrase following the preposition, this seems to be linked to a higher level of struggle with sentence level difficulties. So I mean, the children who were pausing more at these unexpected locations and then maybe trying to self-repair themselves more seem to be also the ones who have more errors at the grammar level and who have like lower scores assessed by both the BPPS and the KELF.
So this will be quite interesting. I think I look forward to seeing more of your results to see if this is a kind of a way that could lead into intervention, or kind of for teachers to pick out children who might have more oral language difficulties compared to others, these specific pauses. Well, thank you very much, Anna, for your time, and thank you all for you've been listening and for all your questions. Big round of applause. We look forward to seeing you all again next week, where the talk, I know who's speaking, but I can't remember what the talk was about. I think it's Jessica Massionet, who's talking about background noises in the home environment. That's it, I remember again. So thank you again very much, and have a good week.
Thank you very much, Jo. Thank you all.
Take care for now. Bye-bye.
Bye.